You know very well that there's a process associated with eating and digesting. We put an element into our mouth and we can tell whether it's bitter or sweet, and it goes through what we can only call a process of ingesting. And so it is also with experiences, perception. So the other day a question was asked, and we all know very well that saying by now, take all perceptions and bring them from the subtle, and so forth and so on. And the question is related to, directly, what it is that occurs when those perceptions come down the channels at the side of the spine and meet at the base of the spine and rise up as our thoughts, our actions. What is it that occurs when perceptions, having passed down these two channels, subjective and objective, male, female, positive, negative, meet at the base of the spine and rise up the central column, called the column of pure mind, and emerge as our thoughts and our actions. To mix the chemistry of a little Tao and a little Siddha, that cusp, that which arose out of the meeting of Hinduism and Buddhism. Vinupā was a young man who from the earliest age had a calling. And so at that early age he enrolled himself in a Buddhist monastery. And for some long years he practiced the tenets and the sutras and the practices of that great faith. But after some years, he awoke one morning and he said, I just feel like eating pigeon, which was against all of the rules. So he called the servants to him, and they went out and caught the pigeons, killed them, and prepared a meal for Vinupā. But the abbot of the monastery noticed that there were no pigeons flying around and asked, where are the pigeons? And so it was whispered that they had been killed and made a meal. And so the search was on to find out who it was. And, of course, they were led to the cell of Vinupā, who was just about to tuck into his meal of roast pigeons. Well, of course, the abbot and the monks were totally aghast. This was against all of the tenets, all of the rules of Buddhism. And so he was ejected from the monastery. But without even a thought, he shed his monk's robes and made his departure. But all of his other monks came out to see him off. And as it happened, Vinupā had to cross a lake But coming to the edge of the lake, he gingerly put his foot out onto a lotus leaf and steadied himself and walked from leaf to leaf across the lake. The monks who were observing this were absolutely shocked and in wonder and awe, so they called him back and asked him how he did that. But they also asked him, "Why did you kill the pigeons?" And Vinupur said, "What killing?" And he ordered the servant to bring him a few of the feathers that had been taken from the pigeons. And holding them in his hand, he held them aloft, and they became live pigeons once again, and flew up into the skies. The story of Vinupur goes on to the wonders that occurred, the adventures he had in meeting demons and ghouls. But that's for another time. But then there's that old story, the Taoist story of Li Tzu, who decided that he would go and become a student of the great old Taoist master who was called Old Sheng. Now when he went to be with Old Sheng, to serve him, Old Sheng took no notice of him at all, except to give him a beating every now and again, or scold him roundly for some reason or other. Many times Li Tzu thought that he would leave in shame and disappointment. But then he remembered that he'd told his wife and family and the people of his village that he was going to the great master so that he could become immortal and ride the wind. So he stayed. But then, after some years, Li Tzu found that he could no longer differentiate between good and bad and right and wrong. He could not even make an opinion, and he dared not speak. That's when Old Sheng smiled at him. And so for more years, Li Tzu continued his meditations and his practices. And after some further years, he found that he could again tell the difference between good and bad and right and wrong. But then he could speak. And when he spoke, he made no judgment about what was coming out of his mouth. That's when Old Sheng called him my son. And then Li Tzu found that his ears had become his nose, and his nose had become his eyes, and his mouth had become all of those. He could not tell the difference between what he was smelling, what he was seeing, what he was hearing, and what he was speaking. So he spoke freely, whatever came into his thoughts. That's when Old Sheng invited him to sit beside him. And then it was time for Li Tzu to return to his home. And when he did, He began to do the washing and take care of the household chores. There was no longer any difference between subjective and objective, male and female. And that's when he found, or did he find, was it Li Tzu riding the wind or the wind riding Li Tzu? Was it Li Tzu going with the flow or the flow as Li Tzu? What is it that occurs for us? We know very well that there was a time when we had to consciously take our perceptions, our experiences, and bring them to what we could call a divine level of mind, the level of Satchitananda. Perhaps we would say, oh, that was all God's business, or that was a big lesson for me. But then we found we no longer needed to do that. Our perceptions, our experiences entered directly that level of Satchitananda and moved into the process of going down the columns at the side of the spine that in these years have been cleaned of. Their incrustations, those things that joined with the experiences and perceptions to colour them. And now they pass freely down to the base of the spine and rise up as our thoughts and our deeds. What is it that occurs for us when these perceptions, our experiences, enter the subtle level of mind? No need with any thought to bring them to that level. Pass down the columns unimpeded by our conditioning, our karma, and meet. What happens? Look to what it is that comes out of your mouth. Look to what it is that is enacted as your deeds. And recognize and know what it is that occurs when all perceptions and experiences make their process to arise as our thoughts and our actions. Look to your thoughts and your actions for the answer.